The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday for Sarah Martinez, the kind of crisp autumn day that made living in Cedar Falls, Iowa, feel like a blessing rather than the small-town trap her college friends had warned her it would become. She pulled her beat-up Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot of Heartland Animal Rescue at exactly 7:30, the same time she'd arrived every morning for the past 3 years, her travel mug of gas station coffee steaming against the windshield as the radio droned on about another tropical storm making its way up from the Gulf. Sarah had never planned on staying in Cedar Falls this long. Fresh out of Iowa State with a degree in veterinary science, she'd intended to use the shelter job as a stepping stone, something to pad her resume before moving to Des Moines or maybe even Chicago. But there was something about the 47 dogs, 12 cats, and handful of rabbits and birds that called this place home that had wrapped itself around her heart, like morning glory vines on a fence post. Maybe it was the way Rocco, the three-legged pit bull mix, would press his massive head against her leg every morning, or how Luna, the blind beagle, had learned to navigate the kennels by following the sound of Sarah's footsteps on the concrete floor. The shelter itself was a converted dairy barn from the 1940s, all weathered wood siding, and a tin roof that sang like a steel drum whenever it rained. The previous owner, Mrs. Henderson, had retrofitted it with modern drainage and climate control, but you could still see the bones of its agricultural past in the high ceilings and the way the morning light slanted through the windows. It sat on 5 acres of pasture land, about 2 miles outside of town, close enough that Sarah could see the water tower and the grain elevator from the back windows, far enough that the dogs could bark without disturbing the neighbors. This particular Tuesday morning felt different, though, charged with the kind of electric tension that preceded summer thunderstorms. Sarah noticed it first in the way the dogs were acting, restless and whimpering, pacing their kennels instead of greeting her with their usual enthusiastic barking. Even Duchess, the elderly golden retriever who spent most days sleeping in a patch of sunlight near the office, was standing at attention, her graying muzzle pointed toward the windows that faced west. The radio in the office was crackling with emergency weather updates when Sarah unlocked the front door, the cheerful morning DJ replaced by the serious voice of Tom Bradley from the National Weather Service office in Des Moines. Remnants of Hurricane Francine, which had devastated Louisiana just days before, were tracking northeast faster than predicted, bringing with it the potential for unprecedented rainfall across central Iowa. The Cedar River, already swollen from recent storms, was expected to crest at levels not seen since the devastating floods of 2008. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she remembered the stories her neighbors had told about that flood, how the water had risen so fast that people had to be rescued from their rooftops, how Main Street had looked like a lake for 3 weeks. The shelter sat in a floodplain, she knew that, but Mrs. Henderson had always assured her that the slight elevation and the drainage system would protect them from all but the most extreme weather events. By 10 o'clock, the first drops were spattering against the windows, fat and heavy like coins falling from the sky. Sarah called her assistant manager, Jake Morrison, a lanky 24-year-old who'd grown up on a corn farm just outside town and had that unflappable Midwestern calm that came from dealing with whatever Mother Nature decided to throw at you. His voice was steady but concerned when she reached him at his apartment above the hardware store downtown. "I'm watching the radar on my phone," Jake said, the sound of his television news in the background. "This thing is bigger than they thought, Sarah. My dad's already moving cattle to higher ground out at the farm. You thinking we should start making some preparations at the shelter?" Sarah looked out at the dogs in their outdoor runs, tails wagging despite the increasingly heavy rain, and felt a familiar surge of protective instinct. "Yeah, I think we should. Can you come in early? I want to get everyone moved to the higher kennels just in case." The shelter was designed with flooding in mind, with the main kennel area built on a raised foundation and a series of upper-level rooms that had once been the barn's hayloft. But moving 47 dogs, especially some of the larger, more anxious ones, would be no small task. Jake arrived within the hour, his rain jacket dripping as he shook it out in the entryway, his usually perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead. "It's getting nasty out there," he said, pulling on his work gloves. "Main Street's already got standing water near the storm drains. Sheriff's Department is setting up barriers by the bridge." They worked methodically, starting with the most vulnerable animals. Luna, the blind beagle, went first, Sarah carrying her carefully up the wooden stairs to the loft area while she whimpered softly against her shoulder. Then came Duchess, who required 2 people to lift safely, and Pepper, a diabetic border collie whose medication schedule made him a priority. The younger, healthier dogs watched anxiously from their kennels as their friends disappeared upstairs, some barking in confusion, others pressing their noses against the chain link as if trying to understand what was happening. By noon, the rain had transformed from heavy drops to sheets of water that obscured the view beyond the parking lot. The Cedar River, normally a peaceful ribbon of brown water that meandered through town past the old flour mill and under the historic covered bridge, had swollen to twice its normal width. Sarah could hear it from the shelter now, a low rumble like distant thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. The power went out at 12:45, plunging the shelter into the grey half-light that came with storms. Sarah's cell phone showed 17 missed calls from her mother in Cedar Rapids, 4 from her ex-boyfriend Derek, who worked for the county emergency management office, and a string of text messages from concerned volunteers and board members. The emergency radio in the office crackled with reports from around the county. Highway 30 closed near Marshalltown due to flooding, several rural roads already impassable, mandatory evacuations beginning for low-lying areas along the river. "Sarah," Jake called from the main kennel area, his voice tight with concern. "You need to see this." She found him standing at the back door, looking out at what had been the pasture behind the shelter just hours before. The water stretched as far as she could see, a brown lake dotted with fence posts and the tops of small trees. It was moving, she realized, not the still water of a pond, but the purposeful current of a river that had found new banks. "How high do you think it'll get?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Sarah checked her phone, trying to get an update on the river levels, but the cell towers must have been affected because she couldn't get a signal. The emergency radio was their only connection to the outside world now, and the news wasn't encouraging. The Cedar River had already exceeded flood stage by 4 feet and was rising at a rate of 6 inches per hour. Worse, a levee had failed upstream near Cedar Falls, sending an additional surge of water downriver toward them. By 2 o'clock, the water had reached the building. Sarah watched from an upstairs window as it crept across the parking lot, swallowing her Honda first, then Jake's pickup truck, then lapping at the bottom step of the shelter's front door. The sound was different now, not the distant rumble of the swollen river, but the immediate presence of water finding its way into every low place, every crack and crevice. "We need to call for evacuation," Jake said, but even as he spoke, they both knew it was too late. The road leading to the shelter had disappeared under 3 feet of fast-moving water, and the emergency radio was reporting that all rescue resources were stretched thin, dealing with evacuations in town. The first floor flooded gradually, then all at once. Sarah and Jake watched helplessly as the water rose past the windows of the lower kennel area, where 12 dogs remained in cages they hadn't had time to move. These weren't the easy cases like Luna and Duchess, but the problematic ones. Rex, a massive Rottweiler mix with aggressive tendencies who required special handling. Bandit, a cattle dog with severe anxiety who bit when stressed. Goliath, a Great Dane who weighed nearly 200 pounds and had hip problems that made stairs impossible, and 9 others who had various behavioral or physical issues that made them difficult to relocate quickly. The water rose slowly at first, just covering the floor, giving the dogs time to jump onto their elevated beds and platforms, but within an hour it was knee-deep, then waist-deep, forcing the animals to stand on their hind legs in their cages, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Sarah could hear them barking and whimpering from downstairs, their voices echoing in the flooded space like cries from a nightmare. "I have to get them out," Sarah said, staring down at the water that now covered the first floor completely. "Sarah, no," Jake grabbed her arm. "That water's moving fast and we don't know what's in it. Debris, chemicals, sewage, and those dogs, they're panicked. You could get hurt or killed." But Sarah was already pulling on her rain boots, checking the flashlight she kept clipped to her belt. She had volunteered for water rescue training the previous summer, thinking it might be useful for helping animals displaced by flooding. She'd never imagined using those skills in her own shelter, but she remembered the basics. Move slowly, test each step, never turn your back on moving water. The stairs down to the main floor disappeared into black water that reflected her flashlight beam like obsidian. Sarah could hear the dogs more clearly now, their barks echoing off the walls in a cacophony of fear and desperation. She took a deep breath and stepped into the water, gasping as the cold shocked her system. It was deeper than she'd expected, coming up to her chest by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs. The current was stronger than it looked from above, trying to push her sideways toward the back of the building where the water was flowing fastest. She used the wall to steady herself, moving hand over hand along the concrete blocks. her feet searching for solid footing on the submerged floor. The familiar layout of the shelter had become an alien landscape, with kennel gates barely visible beneath the surface and debris floating past in the beam of her flashlight. Rex saw her first, his massive head above the waterline as he stood on his back legs in his partially submerged cage. His usual aggressive posturing was gone, replaced by something Sarah had never seen in him before: pure, desperate fear. She fumbled for the latch on his cage, her cold fingers struggling with the mechanism underwater. When she finally got it open, Rex launched himself toward her, his powerful body creating a wave that nearly knocked her over. For a moment, Sarah thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Rex was in full panic mode, his claws scrambling for purchase on her shoulders, threatening to drag them both under. But then she remembered her training, speaking to him in the calm, authoritative voice she'd learned to use with frightened animals, guiding him toward the stairs while keeping her own footing steady against the current. Jake was waiting at the top of the stairs, his face pale with worry. "Sarah, this is insane. The water's still rising." She didn't have time to argue. Bandit was next, the cattle dog's sharp, terrified barks cutting through the sound of the rushing water. Unlike Rex, Bandit tried to bite her as she opened his cage, his fear translating into the aggressive response she'd expected. Sarah had to use a loop leash to control him, difficult work in chest-deep water while maintaining her balance against the current. One by one she brought them up. Goliath, who required all of Jake's help to lift his massive arthritic frame up the stairs. Missy, a pregnant pointer mix who was due to give birth any day. Bear, an ancient bloodhound who could barely swim. Trouble, a hyperactive Jack Russell Terrier who tried to leap from her arms back into the water, and 5 others, each presenting their own unique challenges in the increasingly dangerous conditions. The last dog was the hardest. Princess was a small elderly Chihuahua mix who had been surrendered just the week before when her owner went into hospice care. She was blind, mostly deaf, and had never shown much trust in humans beyond accepting food and basic care. Sarah found her floating in her cage, paddling desperately to keep her head above water, her tiny body exhausted from the effort. When Sarah reached for her, Princess snapped, her small teeth catching the skin on Sarah's thumb. But Sarah persisted, scooping up the terrified little dog and holding her close to her chest as she made her way back toward the stairs. The water was higher now, reaching almost to her shoulders, and the current was stronger. Halfway across the flooded kennel area, her foot hit something solid underwater, a piece of debris that had washed in, and she stumbled. For a terrifying moment, Sarah went under completely, the flashlight torn from her hand and disappearing into the murky water. Princess was swept from her arms by the current, her small form barely visible as the water carried her toward the back of the building. Sarah surfaced, gasping and disoriented, fighting against the current as she searched frantically for any sign of the little dog. She found Princess wedged against a partially submerged kennel gate, her tiny head barely above the waterline, too exhausted to paddle any longer. Sarah dove again, her hands searching blindly until she felt the soft fur and tiny, fragile body. This time she held on with everything she had, fighting her way back against the current to the stairs where Jake was waiting with a rope he'd tied around his waist. By the time Sarah emerged from the flooded shelter carrying Princess, both she and the little dog were shaking from cold and exhaustion. The water had risen another foot while she'd been working, and what had been a dangerous situation was rapidly becoming an impossible one. The emergency radio was reporting that the Cedar River had crested 8 feet above flood stage, and that a second levee failure upstream was sending another surge of water their way. They moved all 35 dogs they'd rescued to the highest point in the shelter, the old grain storage area in the loft that Mrs. Henderson had converted into an overflow space for large animals. It wasn't ideal with concrete floors and minimal heating, but it was dry and 20 feet above the current water level. Sarah found blankets and towels in the supply closet, doing her best to warm the dogs who had been in the water while Jake distributed food and fresh water. The power was still out, but they had a battery-powered radio and a few flashlights. The news wasn't encouraging. The entire downtown area of Cedar Falls was underwater, with water reaching the second floors of buildings along Main Street. Highway 218 was closed in both directions, and the National Guard had been called in to assist with evacuations and search and rescue operations. Sarah's phone finally caught a signal around 6 o'clock, and she was immediately bombarded with calls and messages from worried friends and family members who had seen the news coverage. Her mother was crying when she answered, begging Sarah to find some way to get out of there before the water rose any higher. "Mum, I can't leave them," Sarah explained, looking around at the 47 dogs and 12 cats who had nowhere else to go. "The roads are underwater anyway. We're safer here than trying to evacuate now." "But honey, what if the water keeps rising? What if the building collapses?" Sarah didn't have good answers to those questions. The shelter had been built to withstand normal flooding, but there was nothing normal about this situation. She could hear the water moving beneath them, a constant reminder that they were essentially living on an island now, surrounded by a river that had claimed the entire valley. Jake's family farm was on higher ground, and his father called around 7 to report that he could see the shelter from his top field, completely surrounded by water but still standing. "It looks like you got about 10 feet of clearance still," he told Jake over the crackling phone line. "But there's more rain coming overnight, and they're saying the second surge from that levee break should hit around midnight." That gave them maybe 6 hours to figure out what to do next. The dogs were settling in as well as could be expected, exhausted from the stress of the day. Rex had claimed a corner where he could watch the entrance, his massive head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert. Duchess had found a spot near the heater where she could stretch out her arthritic joints, and Luna was pressed against Sarah's leg, seeking the comfort of familiar human contact. Sarah tried to doze around 9 o'clock, knowing she needed to conserve her energy for whatever challenges the night might bring. But every time she started to drift off, she would hear a sound from below, the crash of something floating into the building or the groan of the structure adjusting to the pressure of the surrounding water. Each noise sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system, reminding her how precarious their situation really was. The second surge hit at 11:47, 23 minutes ahead of the predicted time. Sarah felt it first as a vibration in the floor, then as a change in the sound of the water below. The building shuddered as the new wave of floodwater struck, and she heard windows breaking on the first floor as debris slammed into the structure. Jake was monitoring the emergency radio, his face grim in the flashlight's glow. "Water's up another 4 feet downtown," he reported. "They're evacuating the emergency shelter at the high school because the water's getting close to the second floor." Sarah did the math quickly. If the water here rose proportionally, they would lose most of their safety margin. The loft area would still be above the flood level, but not by much, and if something happened to compromise the building's structural integrity, they would be in serious trouble. At 12:15, Jake's cell phone rang with a call from his father. "Jake, you need to listen to me carefully." The older man's voice was tense. "I'm up in the watchtower with binoculars and I can see the shelter. The water's up to the windows on that second level now, and there's a big propane tank floating toward your building from upstream. Looks like it came loose from somebody's grill or camper." Sarah and Jake looked at each other in the dim light. A propane tank hitting the building could cause serious structural damage, potentially compromising their refuge. But there was nowhere else to go. No way to evacuate 47 dogs and 12 cats in the middle of the night, with water covering everything for miles around. The impact came 10 minutes later, a thunderous crash that shook the entire building and sent several of the smaller dogs into panicked barking fits. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and ran to the window, trying to see what damage had been done. The propane tank had struck the northwest corner of the building, right where the old dairy barn connected to the newer addition that housed the veterinary clinic. For the next hour, they waited and listened, monitoring every sound for signs that the building might be failing. The structure seemed solid, but Sarah noticed that the sound of the water below had changed, becoming more turbulent, suggesting that the building's profile had been altered by the impact. At 2 in the morning, Jake made the call that Sarah had been dreading. "My dad's got his base boat," he said quietly. "Current's too strong for him to get to us tonight, but he thinks he can make it at first light when the water calms down some. We need to start thinking about evacuation." Sarah looked around at the animals depending on them. Some of the dogs were sleeping fitfully, exhausted by the stress and trauma of the day. Others remained alert, sensing the tension in their human caretakers. Princess, the little chihuahua she had nearly died rescuing, was curled up in a blanket near the heater, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "How many can the boat hold?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be enough. 3 people and maybe a dozen dogs, if we're lucky, and the water's not too rough. We'd need multiple trips, and that's assuming the weather holds. Multiple trips meant leaving animals behind between runs, and Sarah knew that every trip would be dangerous, fighting against current and debris in a small aluminum boat. If something went wrong, if the boat capsized or the engine failed, they could lose everything. The rain started again around 3 o'clock, Not the torrential downpour of earlier in the day, but a steady precipitation that meant the water levels wouldn't be dropping anytime soon. Sarah tried to rest, but her mind kept racing through scenarios and contingencies. How would they decide which animals to evacuate first? The oldest and sickest, who were most vulnerable? The youngest and healthiest, who had the best chance of surviving the boat ride? The most aggressive, who posed the greatest risk if they panicked? Dawn broke grey and sullen, the kind of overcast morning that made it impossible to tell what time it was without checking a watch. The rain had stopped, but the world outside the shelter was unrecognizable. A vast lake stretching to the horizon, with just the tops of trees and fence posts marking where the land normally would be. Jake's father arrived at 7:30, his base boat cutting a careful path through the debris-filled water. Tom Morrison was a weathered man in his 60s who had lived through enough Iowa floods to know how to read the current and navigate safely through dangerous conditions. But even his experienced eye was troubled by what he saw. "This is bad, kids," he said as he tied off to the second-story window frame. "Worse than '08, worse than anything I've seen. They're saying it might be a week before the water drops enough for normal rescue operations." A week. Sarah felt her heart sink as she contemplated keeping 47 dogs and 12 cats alive in the shelter's loft for a week, with no power, limited food, and no way to properly clean or maintain sanitary conditions. Some of the older dogs were already showing signs of stress, and she worried about Missy, the pregnant pointer who could give birth at any time. The first evacuation run focused on the most vulnerable animals. Duchess, whose arthritis made it difficult for her to move. Bear, the ancient bloodhound who was showing signs of kidney problems. And several of the smaller, older dogs who would be easiest to transport. Sarah helped load them into transport crates that could be secured in the boat, talking softly to each animal to keep them calm during the terrifying journey. Watching the boat disappear into the grey morning with 6 of her charges aboard was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever done. She had no way of knowing if they would make it safely to higher ground, no communication once they left the range of the cell phone signal. All she could do was trust Tom Morrison's skill and experience and prepare for his return. The second trip went smoothly, taking another 6 dogs, including Rex, whose size and temperament made him a priority for evacuation. But as Tom was loading the crates for the third run, disaster struck. A piece of debris, probably part of a dock torn loose from somewhere upstream, caught the boat's propeller. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Tom worked frantically to clear the debris, but the damage was done. The propeller was bent, and without power, the boat was at the mercy of the current. Sarah watched helplessly as the current began to carry the boat away from the shelter. Tom fighting with the oars to maintain position, but losing ground steadily. "Cut the rope," Sarah shouted, realizing that the boat was in danger of being pulled under by the weight of the building. Tom severed the line with his pocket knife just as the current caught the boat fully, carrying him and 6 terrified dogs rapidly downstream toward whatever obstacles awaited. Sarah and Jake stood at the window, watching until the boat disappeared around a bend in the flooded landscape, taking with it their only reliable means of evacuation. They were alone now, with 35 dogs and 12 cats, surrounded by miles of floodwater, with no way to call for help. The next few hours passed in a blur of practical concerns and growing anxiety. The battery on the emergency radio was dying, giving them only intermittent updates on the flooding situation. What they heard wasn't encouraging. More levees failing upstream, additional evacuations ordered for communities that had thought they were safe, and reports that it might be days before emergency crews could reach some of the more isolated areas. Around noon, Sarah's phone picked up a weak signal, just long enough for her to receive a text message from her mother. Tom Morrison made it safely to evacuation center with 6 dogs. Propeller damaged, but everyone alive. "Hang on, honey, help is coming." The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. Help might be coming, but when? And in what form? National Guard helicopters were being used for human evacuations from rooftops and upper floors, but Sarah doubted they would prioritize animal rescue, especially in conditions this dangerous. As if reading her thoughts, Jake spoke up from his position by the radio. "I've been thinking about the old grain silo," he said, pointing toward the back of the property where a tall concrete structure rose above the floodwaters. "It's got an external ladder, and there's a platform at the top. If we could get the dogs over there somehow, they'd be visible to aircraft, and it's high enough that even if this water rises another 10 feet, they'd still be safe." Sarah looked out at the silo, maybe 100 yards from the shelter. In normal conditions, It would be an easy walk across the pasture. Now it would mean somehow transporting 35 dogs and 12 cats across fast-moving floodwater filled with debris in makeshift rafts or by swimming to a structure that might or might not provide adequate shelter from the elements. But as the afternoon wore on and the water showed no signs of receding, the silo began to look like their best option. The shelter building was solid, but it wasn't designed to house this many animals in the loft space for an extended period. They were already running low on food, and sanitation was becoming a serious problem. Worse, Sarah could feel the building shifting slightly in the current, small movements that suggested the foundation was being undermined by the persistent flow of water. By evening, they had cobbled together a plan using supplies they found in the shelter's maintenance area. Jake discovered a small inflatable raft in the emergency kit, designed for 2 people, but capable of carrying several small dogs at a time. Sarah found life jackets in various sizes, including several dog flotation devices that volunteers had donated for water safety training. They also had rope, waterproof containers for supplies, and most importantly, Jake's farm boy ingenuity when it came to solving practical problems with limited resources. The first test run came at sunset, with Sarah paddling the small raft across the treacherous current while Jake remained in the shelter with the animals. The journey that should have taken 2 minutes stretched to nearly 15 as she fought against the flow and navigated around debris. The silo's ladder was partially submerged, but she was able to climb up to the platform and confirm that it would provide adequate space and shelter for the animals. The evacuation to the silo took all night, with Sarah making trip after trip in the tiny raft, while Jake organized the animals and supplies at the shelter. They started with the cats, who could be transported in carriers, then moved on to the smaller, calmer dogs. Each journey was a battle against current and debris, and more than once Sarah thought she might not make it as waves generated by floating obstacles threatened to swamp the overloaded raft. The most challenging trip came near dawn, when they attempted to move Goliath, the massive Great Dane whose size and weight made him impossible to transport in the small raft. In the end, Sarah had to fashion a harness from rope and life jackets, swimming alongside the big dog as he paddled through the current, guiding him toward the silo while fighting her own exhaustion and the persistent tug of the floodwater. By sunrise, all 47 dogs and 12 cats were safe on the silo platform, along with enough food and water for several days. Sarah and Jake had made their own crossing, just as the morning light revealed the full extent of the flooding. The shelter building, which had been their refuge for 2 days, was now showing serious signs of structural stress, with part of the roof sagging where the propane tank had struck. From their perch 60 feet above the floodwater, they could see for miles in every direction. The landscape was unrecognizable, transformed into an inland sea dotted with the roofs of buildings and the crowns of trees. In the distance, they could make out other survivors on rooftops and high ground, tiny figures waving at helicopters that circled but couldn't land in the treacherous conditions. The rescue came at 11:37 on the 3rd morning, announced by the distinctive thrum of military helicopter rotors cutting through the humid air. Sarah had been taking turns with Jake keeping watch, but she was dozing against the concrete wall of the silo when the sound woke her. At first, she thought it might be another aircraft passing overhead on its way to evacuate human survivors, but this one was circling, clearly looking for something specific. The helicopter was a National Guard Black Hawk, its olive-drab paint scheme and serious, purposeful design a stark contrast to the civilian news helicopters that had been documenting the flooding. As it descended toward their makeshift refuge, Sarah could see the crew chief in the open door, assessing the situation and communicating with the pilot through his headset. The rescue operation was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced, a carefully choreographed ballet of military precision and improvisation. The helicopter couldn't land on the narrow silo platform, so the crew had to use a hoist system to lift the animals in specially designed rescue baskets. Each dog and cat had to be secured in a harness and lifted individually, a process that took nearly 4 hours to complete. Sarah went up with the last group of animals, her feet finally leaving the concrete platform as the winch operator lifted her toward the aircraft. As she rose above the flooded landscape, she could see the full scope of the disaster for the first time. The Cedar River had become a lake stretching from horizon to horizon, with only the highest points of land visible above the brown water. Her little Honda Civic was somewhere beneath those waves, along with Jake's truck and countless other reminders of the normal world that had existed just 3 days before. The helicopter touched down at the Emergency Operations Center, that had been established at the Cedar Falls Regional Airport, one of the few large flat areas in the county that remained above water. Sarah climbed out of the aircraft on shaking legs, her ears ringing from the engine noise, her eyes struggling to adjust to the bright sunlight after days in the grey twilight of the storm. The reunions that followed were emotional, beyond anything Sarah could have anticipated. Tom Morrison was waiting with the 6 dogs he had rescued in his boat, all healthy and well cared for by the volunteers at the emergency shelter. Rex, the massive Rottweiler who had been so frightened during the flood, seemed to recognize Sarah immediately, pressing his great head against her leg in the same gesture of affection he had shown every morning at the shelter. Duchess, the elderly golden retriever, was receiving medical attention from a veterinarian who had volunteered to help with animal rescue operations, but her tail wagged weakly when she saw Sarah approach. Luna, the blind beagle, whimpered with excitement when she heard Sarah's voice, her whole body wiggling with joy at the familiar sound. Even Princess, the tiny chihuahua who had never shown much interest in human affection, seemed different somehow, allowing Sarah to pick her up and hold her close without her usual defensive snapping. Perhaps surviving the flood together had created a bond that transcended the little dog's previous fears and traumas. The media attention that followed was intense but manageable, with reporters drawn to the story of the young woman who had risked her own life to save 47 dogs and 12 cats from the worst flooding in Iowa's recorded history. Sarah found herself uncomfortable with the label of hero that everyone seemed determined to apply to her actions. From her perspective, she had simply done what anyone who loved animals would have done in the same circumstances. The insurance settlement took months to negotiate, but eventually, the Heartland Animal Rescue was rebuilt on higher ground, with improved drainage and emergency systems designed to handle flooding that exceeded even the devastating events of that September. The new facility was larger and more modern, with better medical equipment and expanded spaces for the animals, but Sarah sometimes missed the ramshackle charm of the old dairy barn that had been her second home for 3 years. Most of the animals they had rescued were eventually adopted into loving homes, their survival stories making them celebrities of a sort in the Cedar Falls community. Rex found a home with a retired farmer who had the space and experience to handle a large, strong dog with protective instincts. Duchess lived out her remaining years with a family who understood her special needs and gave her the gentle care her arthritis required. Luna was adopted by a teacher who worked with blind students and who understood the unique challenges and rewards of caring for a disabled animal. Princess, the tiny chihuahua who had nearly drowned in the flood, had perhaps the most surprising outcome. She was adopted by Mrs. Henderson, the shelter's founder, who had been watching the rescue coverage from her assisted living facility and had been moved to tears by the little dog's story. The 2 elderly ladies became inseparable companions, proving that sometimes the most unlikely relationships are also the most enduring. Sarah eventually did leave Cedar Falls, accepting a position with a large animal rescue organization in Denver, where she could use her flood rescue experience to help develop emergency preparedness protocols for shelters in disaster-prone areas. But she carried with her the lessons learned during those 3 terrifying days in September, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when faced with circumstances that demand it, that the bonds between humans and animals can inspire actions that transcend normal limitations, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to abandon those who depend on you, no matter how impossible the situation might seem. The Cedar River eventually returned to its normal banks. The floodwaters receded, and life in Cedar Falls gradually returned to something resembling normal, but the community had been changed by the experience, bound together by shared trauma and the knowledge that they had survived something unprecedented. And somewhere in the rebuilt Heartland Animal Rescue, a plaque on the wall tells the story of September 15th through 18th, when love for animals proved stronger than fear, and when ordinary heroes risked everything to save lives that others might have considered expendable. The flood of 2024 entered the record books as the most devastating natural disaster in Iowa's history, but for Sarah Martinez, it would always be remembered as the moment when she discovered exactly what she was capable of when everything she cared about was on the line. In the end, that knowledge proved to be worth more than everything the floodwaters had taken away.